She crossed the library in 16 steps and laid the petition for annulment on his desk like a thing she had finally decided to be done carrying. For 3 years, Adrian Wren, 4th Duke of Ashbourne, had ignored her at breakfast tables, in corridors, in the long evenings of a house they shared by name and not by company. He had paid her dressmaker. He had quartered her in the East Wing. He had sent his valet to ask her opinion on the menus, the tenants, the planting of the South Meadow, never asking himself. He had treated his wife as a man treats a clock he inherits with the estate. Necessary, kept wound, never met. She had stopped expecting to be met. That is what made this morning different. This morning, she had decided she did not want to be a clock. The document was 3 sheets of paper, tied with a black ribbon her solicitor had chosen for clarity. The first line bore today's date, the 8th of April, 1815. The last line bore her name, in a handwriting steady as glass. Catherine Wren, Duchess of Ashbourne. Adrian, who had been writing a letter to a man in Antwerp about the price of bar iron, did not pick up the pages. He did not move. The pen in his right hand stopped above the paper at exactly the point where, 2 seconds earlier, he had intended to underline a number. He looked at the document. He looked at her. And then he did something a man who had been silent across a marriage for 3 years had no right at all to do. He went the colour of paper. For half a heartbeat, Catherine allowed herself to be a woman who could read a man's face. The colour going first from his temples, then from his mouth. The pen tilting in his fingers as if he had forgotten the way bone meets ink. The long line of his jaw, that jaw she had once, in another life, traced with her thumb on a wedding morning, clenching shut against a word he could not allow out. Then she put the reading away.
She had not crossed 16 steps for theatre.
"I require your signature," she said. Her voice was quiet, because quiet was what travelled in this house. "On all 3 pages, before the courts open on Friday." He set the pen down, the careful, deliberate motion of a man laying down a weapon. Catherine. It was the first time in 18 months he had said her name aloud. She heard it the way a deaf woman hears a string snap somewhere in the next room, distant and yet structurally important. "Adrian, the petition." He stood. He was tall. She'd forgotten, almost, the precise angle at which he filled a doorway. The morning light from the south window fell across the breadth of his shoulders, across the line of a coat she had not chosen for him, across hands that had not touched her since the first month of their marriage. He looked, briefly, like the man she had married. Then he looked, with greater accuracy, like a man who had just been told his house was on fire. "Catherine, please. 2 weeks." "No." One week. "You do not need a week to write a name." "I need." His voice caught on something. He cleared it like a man with a stone in his throat. "I need to speak to you." "You have had 3 years to speak to me." "I am aware." "And in that time you have spoken to me on 12 occasions by my count. I marked them. I am very good at counting." The corner of his mouth did something. Almost a smile, almost a wince. He recognized the count. She had not known he recognized the count. "Catherine, you may have anything else. Anything. The London house, the Brighton estate, my mother's pearls, which I should have had reset for you 4 years ago and did not. You may have the carriage horses. You may have my name in writing, refusing forever to challenge whatever you petition for. But not yet. I do not want pearls. I know. I want my life. I know that as well." She looked at him then. Really looked. Perhaps for the first time in 2 years. He had grown thinner. The skin at his temple was paler than at their wedding. There was a small, healed scar at the corner of his right eye she had not seen acquired. Whose name was on the lips of the woman who had been close enough to see him bleed for it? She stopped that thought before it became a question. The petition between them was not a petition about another woman. It was a petition about herself. 2 days, he said. 1. By the bell at noon tomorrow, he said, I will sign the pages. I give you my word. But before noon tomorrow, you will give me 1 hour in this room, and you will let me say what I should have said 3 years ago. That is all I ask of you. After that, anything you require. A man who had ignored his wife for 3 years did not get to bargain with her. She knew that. She had crossed 16 steps already. She could cross 16 more, out of the room, out of his hours. But the Duke of Ashbourne was the colour of paper. 1 hour, she said. Tomorrow at 11. I will sit in that chair. She did not turn to indicate it, but he knew which chair. And you will sit in this one. And when the bell strikes 12, I will hear no further word. Agreed. And the petition remains where it is. Yes. And if you have not signed by 12, my solicitor proceeds without your hand. Yes. And we do not pretend, between this hour and the next, that I came here for any reason other than the one I have stated. Catherine, yes or no, Adrian? His knuckles on the back of the chair were white. Yes. She turned at the door. She did not mean to. The morning had been planned, every step of it, for 16 there and 16 back. What can possibly, she said, quietly, as if asking the question of the door frame rather than the man, have changed in 3 years that you wish to say it now? He did not answer at once. He looked at the pen on the desk. He looked at the petition. He looked at the south window, where a hawthorn was just beginning to put out its first white blossoms. Nothing has changed, he said. That is the difficulty. She went out before her face could betray her. She closed the library door behind her. She crossed the corridor and took the back stairs and did not, until she reached the small sitting room of the east wing, allow herself to set her hand against the doorframe. She held it there. She held it the way a sailor holds a mast, not for comfort, but against capsizing. The east wing in April smelled of wood smoke, and the polish Polly used on the rosewood escritoire. The fire had burned down to a low orange line that still gave off enough heat to keep the chill of the long stone corridor at bay. Outside the window, Catherine had counted the windows of this room many times, on many mornings, and there were 7, the same 7 there had been on the morning after her wedding. The formal garden was beginning to put out the first green of the season. A pair of thrushes was doing whatever it is thrushes do in April, with vigorous and untranslatable opinion. A delivery cart with a striped canvas hood stood at the kitchen door. A maid was crossing the south lawn with a basket of damp linen. The world, indifferently and on its own schedule, was beginning to be the kind of world that smelled green again. None of which Catherine, in that moment, was registering. Her hand was on the doorframe. Her breath was very level. Her mouth was holding a shape it had not held in 3 years. A shape that contained, however small a portion, hope. She did not yet know that this was what the shape was. She knew only that her teeth were aching, in the way teeth ache when one has been clenching them for some considerable period without noticing. In the library, behind her, the Duke of Ashbourne sat slowly down in his chair. He picked up the pen he had laid down. He drew it across his palm, hard enough to leave a line of ink. He folded the petition with the care of a man folding the corner of a page he was afraid to lose. He set it inside the breast of his coat, against his heart, where the linen of his shirt was already beginning to stain dark with ink. Then he rang for Jepson, his butler, and said the 7 words he had not, in 3 years of marriage, ever said aloud. I think I am going to be sick. Jepson, who had begun service to the late Duke before Adrian was born, who had buried 2 wives of his own with great patience and only the smallest comment, who had a face like a teaspoon and a moral framework like a fortress, set down the silver tray he was carrying. Indeed, Your Grace, he said. Shall I send for tea, or for the chamber pot? Neither. Send for my horse. Your Grace is bleeding. I am aware. On the desk, Your Grace. I am aware of that as well. Jepson did not move. He had, in 28 years, perfected the not moving of a man who has every right to move and is choosing, charitably, not to. Send for the horse, Jepson. Where is your Grace going? To the village, then perhaps to the Fox and Glove, then perhaps a great deal further. Will your Grace be returning? A silence. Adrian, who had ignored his wife for 3 years, who had built the careful architecture of that ignoring with every fibre of his careful architectural soul, looked at the wet ink on his palm.
Yes, he said.
Tomorrow at 11. Send for the horse. He rode out by the South Drive at 10:15, past the gatehouse, past the row of poplars his grandfather had planted in the year of his own marriage, and onto the road that ran east through Ashbourne village. The morning had warmed. The grass at the verge of the road was beginning to send up its first green spears of the season. A cuckoo, in the wood beyond the second farm, was practicing the 2 notes it would, in 3 weeks, be calling continuously. Adrian did not register the cuckoo. He registered instead the throb of his palm against the rain, where the ink and the deeper greys beneath had begun to sting. He registered the smell of his own coat. Cedar, wet wool, a thread of the lavender Polly used in his linen press. He registered, with a kind of slow, inward horror, that he had spent the whole morning preparing to be honest with his wife, and had not, in 3 years, prepared a single line of what to say. The road dipped past Mrs. Henley's cottage. Mrs. Henley, who was 80 and in her doorway peeling potatoes into a wooden bowl, lifted her hand in greeting. Adrian lifted his without looking down. He had passed Mrs. Henley's cottage perhaps 2,000 times in his life, and had, until this morning, taken her acknowledgement for granted, as one takes for granted the existence of a doorstep. The Fox and Glove, when he reached it, was nearly empty. The fire in the taproom had been let go cold. A boy who could not have been 13 was wiping down a long oak table with a cloth that had been wet too long. The publican, a man called Druitt, who had served the Wren's grooms for 30 years, brought him a small glass of dark ale without asking what he wanted, on the principle that a duke who had ridden out at this hour did not require a menu. Adrian sat by the cold hearth. He did not drink. He had not, he realized, intended to drink. He had intended to be in a room that contained no Catherine, no Jepson, no portrait under a sheet, no petition for annulment. The Fox and Glove qualified. He sat for an hour. He watched a fly, of unusual size for so early in April, bump itself patiently against the inside of a leaded window. He thought of his father, a man he had loved unevenly, and who had, by the evidence of one stolen page from a strongbox, also loved the wrong things and refused to tell anyone. And he wondered, for the first time in 3 years, whether the inheritance of that love had been something he could have refused. He had not refused. He had, instead, built a fortress. He had been, by his own design, the 4th Duke of Ashbourne who never quite arrived in his own marriage. The fortress had been costly. It had cost him 3 winters of solitary suppers, 3 Aprils of looking at a hawthorn through a south window without comment, 3 full years of the woman across the corridor whose breathing in sleep he could identify, after all this time, by ear. The cut at his hairline was not from a horse. It was from his own hand, on the iron bracket above the cold fireplace at the Fox and Glove, which he had hit, once, with the side of his head, in a single, foolish movement of self-disgust, while the publican was in the cellar fetching a fresh barrel and could not see. Adrian had cleaned it on his sleeve. He had ridden home, by the longer road through the home wood, with a thin, dried track at his temple, and an idea, half-formed, that he had reached the bottom of a thing he had been falling into for a long time. A man at the bottom of a thing has, at any rate, a floor under him. That, Adrian had decided on the long ride home, was a kind of beginning. Upstairs, in the east wing, Catherine did not weep. She had given up weeping in the 2nd month of her marriage, and had not taken it up again since, on the principle that one did not perform an art for which one had no audience. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed and counted the windows of the room, which she had counted on every difficult morning for 3 years. 7. the same as on the first morning, when she had also counted them, and had also not wept. She had been 25 then. She was 28 now. 3 years was the length of a small war, or the time it takes a hawthorn to make berries. Her maid Polly came in with the breakfast tray she had not eaten. "Your Grace did not touch the toast." "I will eat the toast at supper. Take it away." "His Grace has gone out, Your Grace." "I saw." "He is bleeding, Your Grace." "He has cut his palm on a pen. I have lived with him long enough to know the difference between a wound and an inconvenience." Polly did not laugh, because Polly had been with Catherine for 3 years and had learned in that time that laughter at the Duchess's drier remarks was a thing the Duchess preferred to deliver herself. "Polly, is there a small key in His Grace's dressing room, in the top drawer of the writing table by the window?" A pause. Polly, who knew the inventory of the great house better than any housekeeper, weighed her loyalties briefly and then set them down where they had always been. "There is, Your Grace." "Bring it to me." "Your Grace, His Grace's writing table. Polly, he has gone out. He will not be back before evening, and tomorrow at noon I will have left this house. I do not require you to lie for me. I require you to bring me the key." Polly went. She returned in 7 minutes with a small brass key, no longer than a thumbnail, slightly tarnished from sitting in the back of a drawer for some time. "Your Grace, Mrs. Beverley says Your Grace must take care in His Grace's study. The lock of the second desk drawer is poor. She says Your Grace ought to know that it is poor. She does not say so to anyone else." So even Mrs. Beverley, the housekeeper of 19 years, had taken sides. Catherine had not realized she had been on a side. She had thought she had been alone in a long, well-furnished corridor for 3 years. It was a small revelation, and not, in the moment, an entirely welcome one. "Tell Mrs. Beverley I shall remember her kindness. And Polly, keep the household in their rooms this morning. I have an hour of quiet to take." She crossed the corridor. She crossed the great hall. She crossed Adrian's study, empty, the fire low, the smell of his cologne, cedar, dry tobacco, something like a cold wind off river stones, hanging in the curtains. And she stood at the second desk drawer and tried the key. It did not fit. Mrs. Beverley's warning had been more than a warning. It had been a hint. Catherine drew a hairpin from her chignon and bent over the lock the way her father had once taught her to do, on a rainy afternoon when she was 12 and bored, and had asked him how thieves got into houses. Her father, the late Mr. Aldenford, had been a country gentleman of strong inheritance and stronger opinions, and had answered every question his only daughter asked, on the principle that the world owed her a complete set of facts. The drawer opened. What was inside took her some minutes to understand. Or rather, the items required understanding in stages. The first stage was inventory. She lifted them out one by one and laid them in a row across the green leather of the desk. Letters, ledger, leather case, velvet-wrapped miniature. She used her handkerchief between her fingers and the paper because she was a methodical woman, and methodical women preserved evidence. The second stage was identification. The handwriting on the ledger was Adrian's. She had seen it on 3 letters during their courtship. A tall, slightly leaning hand, with the long descenders of a man who had been taught his copperplate by a tutor from Edinburgh. The paper of the ledger was the same blue-grey foolscap the steward used for the estate accounts. The £40 entries were in 2 columns, date and recipient. The recipient column held 2 words only, written and rewritten 36 times. Mrs. Carmody. The third stage was meaning. Catherine sat down, not, at first, in his chair, but in the upright reading chair beside the window, and set her hands flat on her lap, and considered what she was looking at. A man who paid £40 a month, faithfully, to a woman called Mrs. Carmody for 36 months, did so for one of 3 reasons. Either the woman was a dependent of his father whose pension had been mishandled, and Adrian had quietly corrected the mismanagement, or the woman had been Adrian's housekeeper at some earlier period, and this was a settlement, or the woman was Adrian's dependent for some less straightforward reason. Catherine was a woman who liked, in private, to consider all three possibilities at once before settling on the least insulting. She did not, at this stage, settle. She picked up the velvet bundle. The miniature in oil on ivory, 3 inches by 2, had been painted by an unsteady but very attentive hand. The brushwork on the lace at the throat was almost too careful. The hand of an amateur who had been taught to draw and had never been taught to paint with confidence. The face was hers. The expression was the half-turned, half-laughing expression she had worn, briefly, on the chapel steps, between the rector's blessing and the moment her new husband had taken her arm. She had not known anyone had been studying her face on the chapel steps. The miniature was wrapped in a square of dark velvet, the kind of velvet a man kept things in if he intended to look at them often. There were letters, a great many letters. The most recent dated 3 weeks ago. The handwriting was not one she had seen before, but the wax seal was clear. A leaping wolf, the crest of Lord Hargrove of the neighbouring estate. There was a ledger in Adrian's hand, recording payments of £40 a month, made on the 1st of every month, for 36 months exactly, to a name she did not know. Mrs.
Carmody, care of Brown & Sons, Lyme, Devonshire.
There was a small leather case. Inside the case, a pair of gloves she had given him on the 2nd week of their marriage, and had assumed he had thrown out. They were folded, as if they had been folded a great many times. And at the back of the drawer, wrapped in a square of dark velvet, there was a small painted miniature, perhaps 3 inches across, oil on ivory, of a woman in a wedding gown. She was looking just past the painter's shoulder, the way brides look when they have just turned to the next person in line. The light was the light of an April morning. The dress was the dress Catherine had worn on the 8th of April, 3 years and 3 days ago. The face was Catherine's own. She sat down in Adrian's chair. She did not weep. She had given up weeping, but for the first time in 3 years, she felt something move in her. Neither anger nor relief, but a slow turning, the way a heavy ship turns into a wind it has been refusing to acknowledge. Then she read the letters. By the time the long case clock in the hall struck noon, Catherine Wren, formerly Aldenford, of Aldenford Court in Hampshire, presently Duchess of Ashbourne, had read enough of them to know that the man she had decided to leave was not, after all, the man she had thought she had been married to. She did not know yet who he was. She knew he was different. She knew he was complicated. She knew that whatever he wished to say to her at 11 the next morning, he had been preparing to say it, badly, for 3 years. She locked the drawer. She returned the key to its place. She went up the stairs. She walked through the gallery. She stopped in front of the door of his dressing room, which she had never, not once in 3 years, opened. And she opened it. There was a portrait on an easel under a sheet. She lifted the sheet. The portrait was of her, again as a bride, but unfinished. Painted in his hand, which she remembered from the long letters of their courtship. He had drawn small marginalia in the corners of his pages, country churches and herons, and once, foolishly, a lopsided sketch of his own dog, but had never seen at oils. He had been at it for some time. The face was finished, the hands were not. The dress was rough-blocked. The background was a window opening on a hawthorn tree she recognized. The tree outside the south library window, just now beginning to flower. He had been painting her, from memory, for 3 years. She let the sheet fall. Downstairs, far away, she heard hooves on gravel. He had returned earlier than expected. She heard Jepson's voice, level and dry. She heard the great hall door close. She heard his bootsteps on the marble, and she found, to her interest, that she could now identify them. She had been able to, all along. She wiped her hands on her skirts as if she had touched something dusty, although she had not. Then she went to meet him in the great hall, because she did not, today, intend to be a clock. He was on the bottom step of the staircase. His hat was in his hand. There was a cut on his hairline, freshly opened, a thin red track that had run down his temple and dried into the collar of his shirt. "I beg your pardon," he said, looking up. I did not expect your grace in the hall.
I am not always in the East Wing. I have rooms throughout.
I am aware.
What happened to your hairline, Adrian?
I fell from a horse.
You did not.
A pause. I did not. You went to Lord Hargrove's. I went to a tavern. A tavern Lord Hargrove is known to attend. Lord Hargrove is not known to attend the Fox and Glove. The Fox and Glove is for honest men, of which his lordship is not, at present, an example. And you are an honest man, Adrian. On Tuesdays. This is Tuesday. She did not laugh. She nearly did. She did not because she was not yet ready to laugh, and because Jepson, behind Adrian's shoulder, was watching with the deadpan absorption of a man who had been waiting a long time for the play to start its third act.
Jepson, Catherine said.
Has His Grace eaten today?
Not since yesterday's supper, Your Grace.
Has he had the cut attended to?
Not yet, Your Grace.
Bring tea. Bring something to eat. Bring a clean cloth and warm water and the small enamel bowl. Bring it all to the library.
Your Grace.
And Adrian.
Yes.
I have had a difficult morning. I did not expect to have a difficult morning. I expected to deliver 3 sheets of paper and to leave. I should like to ask you a single question now, and I should like you to answer it now, because I do not want to wait until 11 tomorrow to know. He set his hat on the side table. He did not move further.
Yes.
Who is Mrs. Carmody? She had not, in advance, decided which of the 4 mysteries to ask first. She found, when her mouth opened, that this was the one. The other 3 could wait. The other 3 were dangerous. The letters, the miniature, the portrait. And a woman of sense did not lead with her dangerous evidence. She led with the one whose answer would tell her whether she could trust any of the others. Adrian, even bleeding, even unsteady, even as the color in his face went out for the 2nd time that day, answered without hesitation. My father's housekeeper, Mrs. Anne Carmody. She raised me from the age of 4 until I went up to Eton. My father pensioned her badly. I have made up the difference since I came into the title. £40 a month, paid through Brown & Sons of Lyme. She is 71 and has rheumatism in her knees and a cottage with a garden that wants weeding. She does not know I am the one paying. She believes the late Duke arranged it before he was carried away from us. I would not wish to disturb that belief. It was the longest single speech Adrian had made in Catherine's presence in 3 years. She listened to it the way one listens to the verdict of a jury. Why did you not tell me? He looked at his hat on the side table. He looked at his hand. He looked, finally, at her. Because a duke who pensions his old housekeepers is a softer man than I had decided to permit myself to be. I had, for reasons I will explain at 11, decided to permit myself nothing soft. £40 a month is the entire softness I have allowed myself for 3 years. I did not tell you because telling you would have required me to be the man I had decided not to be. Adrian. Yes. Sit down. You are bleeding on the marble. He sat down on the bottom step of the staircase. She sat, after a moment, on the step beside him. A duchess, in the entrance hall of her own great house, on a stair, 2 feet from a man she had crossed 16 steps to leave that morning. Jepson, behind them, did not blink. Jepson had served the late Duke for 30 years. He had seen a great many things on a great many staircases. I will keep my appointment at 11 tomorrow, she said. But I will keep it differently. I will sit in your chair, not in mine. I have decided I am tired of sitting in the chair you allotted me. Yes, Your Grace. And Adrian? Yes. You will eat the supper Jepson has been bringing up to your study every evening for 3 years. The one you do not eat. That ends tonight. If we are to have a difficult conversation tomorrow morning, I require both of us to have eaten. Yes. And one further thing. Polly is going to attend that cut. She is better at it than your valet. Yes. He looked at her, briefly, with the open face she remembered from the morning of their wedding, and she found she could not, after 3 years, sit beside it for long. She rose. She nodded at Jepson. She went up the stairs. She did not look back, because looking back would have undone 3 years of careful dignity, and she was not, yet, prepared to undo 3 years of anything. She had 4 hours until supper. She used them as Catherine Wren, daughter of a methodical man, would use them. She made a list. The list was 3 columns wide and 2 pages long. Column 1, things Adrian had told her this morning. Column 2, things she had found in his drawer. Column 3, questions for 11 o'clock tomorrow. By the time the supper bell rang, the list had grown a 4th column. Things she would require of her husband, if she chose, after all, not to leave him. The dinner was the first they had eaten together in the dining room since the 2nd month of their marriage. It was not romantic. It was not even tender. It was 2 adults at opposite ends of a long oak table, with Jepson serving silently between them, while a cool spring rain began to wash the gravel of the South Drive. Adrian, with the cut at his hairline cleaned and plastered, ate everything that was put in front of him with the resigned obedience of a man on the 2nd day of an illness. Catherine, at her own end, ate 3 full courses for the first time in 18 months, and surprised herself several times with the discovery that her appetite had not, in fact, vanished. It had merely been waiting for permission. They did not speak. Once, between courses, Adrian said, "The hawthorn outside the library is in flower this year." She said, "Yes, I noticed it this morning." He said, "It was not in flower the year we married." She said, "It was not. I remember. The blossom was 3 weeks late." He looked at her, briefly, across the length of the table. "I remember as well." It was not a great deal to say, after 3 years. It was, however, more than they had said at any previous supper. She returned to her room and slept, against expectation, deeply. She had expected to lie awake. She had laid out, in her mind, the order of the questions she would ask in the morning, the order she would not ask, the order in which she would deliver her own portfolio if the conversation reached that point. She had set the candle on the mantelpiece for the long inspection of an unsettled night. The candle, when she woke at 5, had burned 3/4 down without her supervision. A kind of treasonous peace, she thought, fishing for irritation, and not quite catching it. The body had decided things the mind had not. She rose at 6. She wrote a brief letter to Mr. Whitmore Brown in London, instructing him not to act on Friday's filing date until further notice. She sealed it and gave it to the Morning Post. She bathed. She dressed in the dove-grey morning gown that suited her best for occasions in which she did not yet know what role she would be playing. She walked the gallery once, slowly, with her hand brushing the carved oak of the banister rail, the wood worn dark and smooth by 3 centuries of Wren women descending to breakfast. She had touched it for the first time, as a Wren, 3 years ago, in a wedding gown, on the way down to a chapel where a man had said yes to her, in a voice he had been preparing, she now understood, to spend 3 years recanting. She breakfasted, alone, at the long oak table where she had eaten supper the night before. The candles had been replaced. The hawthorn outside the south library window, she could see the corner of it from the dining room if she leaned a little, was still in flower. She drank 1 cup of tea and ate 3/4 of a piece of toast. Then she went to the library, 10 minutes early, and took her chair. She did not, today, count the steps. It was no longer a journey for which she required a count. At 11 the next morning, she sat in his chair. He sat in hers. It took him 43 minutes to say everything he had been preparing for 3 years. She let him take all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not, except once, change expression. Her face was the face her father had taught her to keep when receiving difficult news from solicitors, builders, or men proposing marriage on insufficient evidence. Composed, attentive, signaling nothing. What he told her was this. On the night before their wedding, the 7th of April, 1812, he had received, by a private courier whose face he did not see, a letter from Lord Edmund Hargrove of Hargrove Hall, the estate that bordered Ashbourne to the north. The letter contained 2 things. The first was a copy of a private paper from 1789, written in the hand of Adrian's father, the third Duke. In that paper, the late Duke had documented, in considerable detail, a fraud he had perpetrated upon the family of one Sir George Hargrove, Lord Hargrove's father, by which Sir George was bankrupted, the Hargrove estates entailed to a creditor friendly to the Wrens, and Sir George's wife driven, eventually, into a long, quiet decline, from which Lord Hargrove had never quite forgiven the world. The paper had been written as a kind of confession, intended for Adrian on his coming of age. Adrian's father had not lived to see his son's coming of age. The paper had been stolen from Adrian's father's strongbox by a steward whose name was no longer remembered. The second was a list of names. Catherine's father, Mr. Aldenford, was at the top of the list. Beneath him were the names of 7 men of business and 3 of his closest tenants. At the bottom was Catherine herself. The letter said, "Make her your duchess if you must, Wren. The world expects it. Your father arranged it. My father would have arranged the same had his fortunes permitted it, and will not stand in the way of 2 old contracts. But make her your wife in any meaningful sense, and I will publish the enclosed paper and bring 40 witnesses to prove it, and ruin your name. And because your name and your wife's name are now contractually one, I will ruin her also. Your father's land is, in part, on what should have been my mother's. Half her holdings are vulnerable. I have the lawyers ready. If you make her a duchess in name only, if you live as you must seem to live, separately, civilly, without children, I will let her keep what she has. If you make her your wife in body, in mind, in love, I will take from her everything your father took from mine. My patience ended on the day my father did. I do not require it to recover." Adrian, on the night before his wedding, had read the letter 3 times. Then he had ridden, in the dark, the 7 miles to Hargrove Hall, where he had been received civilly in a study lit by 2 candles. Lord Hargrove, only 7 years older than Adrian, but wearing the face of a man who had decided some time ago to be older, had declined to negotiate. The terms were as written. There were no other terms. If Adrian wanted Catherine to be safe, Adrian would marry her tomorrow, and then, gently, decisively, lastingly, withdraw from her. Adrian had ridden home and married her in the morning. He had withdrawn that night, from her bed, from her conversation, from her presence. He had built around her, in the years since, an elaborate, expensive, courteous fortress of inattention, calibrated to suggest to any watching eye, and there were watching eyes, there were always watching eyes, that the Duke of Ashbourne neither valued nor much noticed his duchess. The fortress had worked. Hargrove had not moved against her, not in 3 years. Then, 3 weeks ago, Hargrove had written again. The letter Catherine had read in the locked drawer. The arrangement, the letter said, no longer pleased him. "Your wife," Hargrove had written, "has begun to receive interesting correspondence from London. A gentleman by the name of Mr. Whitmore Brown. I begin to wonder if she has been less inattentive than you have been. I begin to wonder if our arrangement has been a courtesy I extended for no return. I shall be in attendance at the Earl of Brackbury's spring ball on the 3rd of May. We will speak there. Until that day, keep her at home, Wren. Or do not. It hardly signifies. The board has been resetting itself for some time." Catherine had read this letter the previous afternoon. She had read it 3 times. Mr. Whitmore Brown, of London, was the solicitor she had retained 4 months ago to draft the very petition she had laid on Adrian's desk that morning. She did not tell Adrian, at 11 the next morning, what she had read, or what Mr. Brown had been corresponding with her about. She let him finish. He was, by the end of his account, sitting forward in her chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped between them, the way a man sits in a chapel pew when he has come not for comfort, but for verdict. The fire, which Jepson had lit at 10:30 and had not had to feed since, had burned to a glowing, low bed of coals that breathed warmth in slow waves into the room. The hawthorn outside the south window was casting a pattern of pale sun and white blossom shadow across the carpet, in slow movement, as the spring wind worked the branches. When he had finished, the long case clock in the corner of the library struck 12:15. The chime rang flat and dry through the room. 3 slow strokes, the last of them attenuating itself to a thin, held tone the carpet absorbed reluctantly.
Catherine waited until the silence after the chime had reassembled itself before she spoke. She wanted the words to have a clean place to land.
Adrian, I'm going to repeat back to you, in the simplest terms I can find, what you have just told me. You will not interrupt. You will say only yes or no in turn. I require this exercise because the matters at hand are large, and I do not wish either of us to leave this room mistaken about the shape of what has been done. He folded his hands more tightly. He did not answer. She had not yet asked. You ignored me to protect me.
Yes.
You did not consult me.
No.
You did not give me the chance to fight beside you.
No.
You took 3 years of my life.
A pause. He looked at the carpet. He looked at the petition, now resting on the desk where she had laid it the morning before. He looked at her. Yes. A long silence. The hawthorn outside the south window was in full flower now. The room smelled, faintly, of the white blossoms and beeswax and the dry edge of old paper.
And what will you do, she said, if I sign the petition this morning, and Lord Hargrove arrives at the Brackbury ball in 3 weeks' time, expecting to find an unmarried duchess to humiliate?
I will be there. He will not humiliate you.
You will not be there. I will not be your wife.
I will be there as the man who was your husband.
He will laugh.
He will not laugh long.
You will ride to a tavern and come back bleeding.
I will, if necessary.
That is not a plan.
No.
That is an improvisation. Improvisations are how men with broken plans pretend to be men with plans.
Yes.
Adrian, listen to me very carefully. I am going to say a great many words now. I require you not to interrupt.
He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at her. He did not interrupt.
You have built this fortress alone.
You have manned its walls alone for 3 years. You have, in the manner of a particular kind of man, decided that doing so privately was a proof of your love. It was not. It was a proof of your fear. She paused. The fire moved a single coal in the grate. He did not look up. She had not asked him to.
And it was a kind of insult you may not have noticed. You treated me as a thing to be defended, rather than a person to fight beside. You did not ask me whether I would prefer 3 years of polite distance, or 3 years of partnership in ruin. You decided. You decided for me. You took the decision out of my hands, the way one takes a heavy plate from a child's hand, with the kindness of someone who imagines themselves wiser.
A breath.
She set her palms flat on the arms of his chair. He had been her husband, technically, for 3 years. She had only now, in the last 24 hours, become his wife in a sense the world would have recognized as such. The seat of him was warm. I am not a child, Adrian. I was your wife. I was your wife on the morning you read that letter. I would have been useful. I would have been very useful. I have been keeping notes, Adrian, for 3 years, on a man I was not allowed to know, in a house I was not allowed to influence. I am a woman who keeps notes. Let me show you what I have. She rose and crossed to the small writing desk in the corner of the library and unlocked its lower drawer with a key she had not, in 3 years, been observed using. She brought back a small leather portfolio tied with a cord of dark green silk. She set it on the desk between them. This, she said, is what your wife has been doing while you were doing what you decided to do. Inside the portfolio were 38 pages of documents. Some were copies. Some were originals.
Some were letters in her father's hand, dated 1788 to 1791. Some were entries from estate ledgers, dated 1789. 2 were signed depositions, each almost 25 years old, from solicitors now deceased. One, and this was the document Adrian's hand stopped at, was a personal letter from the late Sir George Hargrove to the late Mr. Aldenford, dated July 1789, asking for assistance in a matter of the most pressing dishonour committed against my house by a peer whose name I will not yet write, but whom I shall name to the Court of Chancery before October next. My father, Catherine said quietly, was Sir George Hargrove's solicitor. Briefly. At a moment when, as I now understand, your father was preparing to ruin Sir George. Sir George approached my father privately. My father, for reasons I did not, at the time, know, declined the case. That refusal cost my father a friendship, and, I suspect, some considerable peace of mind in the last decade of his life. He kept these papers in a strong-box at Aldenford Court. After he was carried away, 8 months before our wedding, I inherited the box. I did not, at first, read its contents. After our marriage, when it became apparent that something in this house was not as I had been led to expect, I read the contents very carefully. I was my father's daughter. My father, when he could not understand a thing, made a list. She took a slow breath. I've been keeping this portfolio in my mother's old jewellery casket in the East Wing. Polly knows. Mrs. Beverley knows. Jepson knows. They have known, in various degrees, for somewhere between 2 years and 3 months. They are good servants. They are also human beings who saw their duchess being shelved like a vase, and they decided some time ago that they would not interfere. But they would not, if asked, lie. Adrian, look at me. He had been staring at the document. He looked up. I have known something was wrong since the morning after our wedding. I have not known what. I have gathered, over 3 years, what I could. I had reached the point where I had enough material to ruin Lord Hargrove, but not enough material to know whether ruining him would also ruin you. I could not act without knowing. She let the sentence settle, the pen in his hand. He had picked up a pen in the course of her speech, almost involuntarily, the way another man might pick up a glass, had begun to leave a small, crooked line on the blotter. She did not point this out. I could not ask you, because you were not speaking to me. I could not leave, because leaving without acting felt like an abandonment of a problem I now believed was real. So I did the only thing left. I had Mr. Brown draft an annulment petition. I intended to deliver it to you, and I intended to watch your face when I did. He set the pen down. He set it down with the tenderness of a man placing a chance hand on a coverlet. I needed to know whether you would let me go without explanation, in which case Hargrove was not the issue. You simply did not love me. Or whether you would beg me to wait. I needed your face, Adrian. I needed to read your face for the answer to a question I had been carrying for 3 years. Do you understand? He understood. The understanding moved across his face, the way a wave moves across a beach. Slowly, and then all at once. Yes. She told him she did not require the petition to be signed that day. He said he was aware. She told him that there was something else she required of him. I require that we now, together, destroy Edmund Hargrove. Not gently, not slowly, not through one careful maneuver at a society ball. I require that we ruin him by the 17th of June, publicly, permanently, by documented evidence in the courts, in the papers, in the Lords. I require that we go to London tomorrow morning. I require that we take the portfolio and your evidence and Mrs. Carmody's old correspondence, which I noticed in the bottom of your drawer and which contains, if I have read it correctly, a useful witness. And I require that we go to Mr. Whitmore Brown, who is, in addition to my solicitor, a personal friend of 2 members of the bench. I require that you be my partner now. I require that we no longer protect each other from information. I require that we be, for the duration of this matter, one person. Adrian was crying, quietly, politely, the way a man cries when he is, for the first time in his adult life,
allowed to. He nodded once, slowly, with the gravity of a man receiving a charge for which he has been waiting too long. She watched the nod settle on him, and then, without softening, set out her conditions. After Hargrove was ruined, she told him, after the matter was closed, she would decide whether to sign the petition. She had not yet decided. He was not to pressure her. He was not to perform repentance, nor to buy her jewelry, nor to ride to taverns. He was not, ever again, to decide for her what she was permitted to know about her own life. If he ever did, and here, for the first time, she leaned forward across the desk and made him meet her eyes, she would leave the same week. She would not threaten. She would go. "I know," he said. "Then we are partners." "Yes. And one more thing." "Yes." "The portrait in your dressing room." He covered his eyes with one hand. "Catherine. Finish it. From observation, not memory. I will sit for you on Tuesday evenings, after supper, in the library, in this chair, in the ruby gown my dressmaker is finishing this week. You have not painted in 3 years. You will paint badly at first. I will tell you when the work is good enough. I do not, particularly, expect it to be a very good painting. I expect it to be a true painting, which is different. You are not a great painter. You are an attentive one. That will do. Tuesdays. Every Tuesday, until the painting is finished, or until I leave you, whichever comes first." He laughed, then a single, wet, surprised laugh, and Jepson, on the other side of the library door, took the opportunity to come in with the tea. They went up to London that afternoon. They went together in one carriage, with Polly and Adrian's valet on the box, with the portfolio on the seat between them, with the petition still, Catherine had not asked for it back, folded in the breast of Adrian's coat. It is not necessary to recount everything that happened in London over the following 2 weeks, because what happened in London was, in essence, the visible outworking of a thing that had already been decided in the library at Ashbourne on the morning of the 9th of April. Mr. Whitmore Brown, of Brown and Beach, of Lincoln's Inn, a man of 70 whom Catherine had retained on her father's old recommendation, looked at the portfolio for a quarter of an hour and said, "Ah," with a kind of grim professional pleasure. He set the documents in 3 small piles on his enormous walnut desk, in a sequence that appeared, to anyone observing, to be alphabetical, and was, in fact, strategic. He took out a fresh sheet of paper, wrote 4 names down, looked up at Catherine and Adrian, and said, "Your graces will require a week." Then he rang for his clerks, who were 4 in number, and put all 4 of them on the matter without further ceremony. By the 3rd day, Brown's clerks had located 2 living witnesses to the 1789 fraud, Mrs. Anne Carmody being one, and an aging Mr. Tilney of Bath being the other, and had persuaded both to give sworn statements. Mrs. Carmody, on being told for the first time who had been pensioning her these 18 years, set down her teacup with great care, looked at Adrian for a long moment over the rim of her spectacles, and said only, "I had wondered. The Duke, your father, was not the man for it. I am glad it was you." She gave her statement that same afternoon, in a clear country hand, with one paragraph in which she described, with the precision of a woman who has spent 40 years polishing the silver of a man she did not respect, the late Duke's habits, his desk, his strong-box, and the morning she had seen the steward leave the study with the paper folded inside his coat. By the 7th day, Brown had filed papers in the Court of Chancery, opened a private inquiry through the Lord Chancellor's office, and placed 2 carefully verified accounts in the more discreet London papers. By the 10th day, Lord Hargrove's lawyer had presented at Brown and Beach with a request for a private conversation. By the 12th day, Lord Hargrove himself had retired, indefinitely, to a small house in the north of England, and his peerage had been quietly stripped of 3 of its most lucrative magistrate appointments, pending a matter in the Lords expected to take 18 months, and to end, in all likelihood, badly for him. He was not ruined. He was eclipsed. Brown, who had been a solicitor for 46 years, said it was, on the whole, the cleaner outcome.
Catherine and Adrian took rooms at his townhouse in Brook Street, which had been kept, by an indifferent housekeeper and a parsimonious agent, in a state of slowly increasing dust since the late Duke's death. They did not, at first, sleep in the same room. They occupied opposite corners of the house, she in the south-facing chamber that had been the late Duchess's, he in his father's old bedroom on the east side, and met for breakfast in a small back parlour where a fire had been lit at 6. The arrangement had not been discussed. It had simply been the arrangement they fell into, the way two people who had been married 3 years on paper and 3 days in any meaningful sense fall into provisional habits without ceremony. The Brook Street house was a tall, narrow box of brick and white stone, 4 stories high, with an iron railing in front and a small private garden at the back, enclosed by a wall of weathered London brick. The garden, which had not been tended since the previous summer, contained 1 ash tree, 2 rose bushes that had reverted to wilderness, a stone bench rusted at the joints, and a small fountain that no longer ran. Catherine, on the 3rd morning, instructed the housekeeper to bring out a pair of secateurs and to find a man for the fountain. By the 5th morning, the roses were beginning to admit they had been roses, and the fountain was making the small, confidential noise that small fountains make. They walked, in the afternoons, in the gravel paths of the small private garden, while Brown's clerks did their work and the spring rain came and went. They walked apart, at first, by a yard or so, then by less. By the 7th afternoon they were walking close enough that the hem of Catherine's pelisse brushed the toe of Adrian's boot at every other step, and neither of them remarked on the fact, because remarking would have required acknowledging a thing both of them were content to allow without acknowledgement. Catherine, in those London weeks, learned the rhythm of Brown and Beech's offices, the Lincoln's Inn courtyard with its single tilted lamp-post, the worn flight of stone steps, the entrance hall with its 2 ferns and its old porter, the long upstairs corridor with its smell of beeswax and law paper, and a particular variety of stale pipe smoke that did not seem to come from any one source. She came to know each of Brown's 4 clerks by their writing hands, since she rarely saw them in person. They were forever bent over deeds in a back room, and were brought out, in turn, only to deliver the small bows that men of their kind delivered to a duchess who had walked unannounced into a working office. In the evenings, Catherine read. Adrian wrote letters. The letters were long, and were addressed to people he had not written to in 3 years. Old schoolfellows, a cousin in Edinburgh, his mother's sister in York, and were, in their own modest way, the slow re-stitching of a man back into the fabric of his world. Catherine did not read his letters. She did not require to. She could see, at the end of every evening, the lift of his shoulders as he set them aside, and she had come, very quickly, to recognize that lift as the first symptom of a man who was, against considerable resistance, beginning to be at peace. The Earl of Brackbury's spring ball took place on the 3rd of May, as planned. The Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne attended. They arrived together. Catherine wore the ruby gown her dressmaker had finished 4 days earlier. Adrian wore evening dress, and a small white scar at his hairline, and the air of a man who has not, for some time, been allowed in a place full of music, and is uncertain whether to enjoy it. Lord Hargrove did not attend. His name, Catherine noted with a small private satisfaction, had been crossed off the guest list in the steward's neat hand. Brackbury House, on a May evening, smelled of wax candles and lemon polish and the warm green air of a great square garden whose lilacs were beginning to come in. The ballroom was lit by 5 chandeliers, hung at staggered heights, each carrying 80 wax tapers. The light from them moved across the polished floor like water moving across the bottom of a shallow pool. There were 40 couples on the floor when the Wrens entered. There were 3 rooms full of people whose principal occupation, in the spring of 1815, was the careful observation of which marriages were standing up and which were not. Catherine, on her husband's arm, was perfectly aware that they were being watched. She had, in her time, walked into a great many rooms of which the same had been true. She had also, in her time, carried a portfolio against the same risk. The portfolio she had brought tonight was not on paper. The portfolio was the way Adrian's hand sat against the small of her back as she stepped over the threshold.
The way her ruby gown took the chandelier light and threw it forward like a small private signal across the room. The way she did not, on entering, look for anyone in particular. The watching dowagers, observing all three things, drew the conclusion they had been instructed by recent gossip to draw, that there was, here, no marriage to be ended. The conclusion was technically incorrect. Catherine intended to keep it that way for as long as suited her. In the dance, a quadrille, simple, four-square, the kind of dance that gives a man's hand permission to settle briefly at his wife's waist without comment from the watching dowagers, Adrian set his palm against the small of Catherine's back, and she let it stay there, and the watching dowagers commented anyway, but politely. "You have not danced with me since our wedding," Catherine said, low, beneath the music. "I am aware." "You have improved." "I have not." "You have. You used to lead like a man on a parade ground. You now lead like a man who has noticed I am also dancing." "That," Adrian said, "is because I have noticed." She did not answer. She allowed him the line. They went home in the early hours. The carriage rocked along the gravel of the South Drive at Ashbourne, and the moon was bright enough that Catherine could see the hawthorn outside the South Library window had finished its blossoms and was beginning to set its small green berries. April had become May. The world had, for the first time in 3 years, been allowed to move. The first Tuesday came 2 weeks later. After supper, Catherine put on the ruby gown again. She would, in time, have other gowns, other Tuesdays, other portraits. But the first one was the ruby. And she sat in the library, in his chair, while Adrian set up his easel by the south window. He was clumsy with the brushes for a quarter of an hour. He was less clumsy after that. By 9 o'clock, he had blocked in the line of her shoulders. By 9:30, he had stopped working and had simply been looking at her for some minutes. "You may resume," Catherine said. "I am observing." "You required observation." "I required painting. The observation is preliminary." "It is, at present, also pleasant." "Adrian." "Yes." "The painting." He resumed the painting. The first Tuesday did not become a kiss. Neither did the second. The third Tuesday did. He set down his brush and crossed the room and said, "I am going to require, at this point, to put my mouth somewhere on you. The choices appear to be the back of your hand or the corner of your mouth. I leave the choice to you, since I have decided, you may recall, never again to decide on your behalf." Catherine considered him for a long moment. "The corner of my mouth, Adrian, with your hand at the back of my neck, where it has not been in 3 years. I have an idea of how it ought to feel, and I should like, at this point, to verify the idea." He verified the idea. The kiss was longer than either of them had planned. It was the kind of kiss that put paid, in a single 8-minute exchange, to 3 years of inattentive supper, separate doorframes, and unwritten letters. It was, also, the kiss of 2 adults who had, by then, fought a small private war together and won it. And that, Catherine thought afterwards, was perhaps where the kiss carried what it carried. It was not the kiss of the second month of their marriage. It was a kiss that had been earned, very expensively, against the grain of 3 years of foolishness. "I love you," Adrian said, into her hair, when the kiss was over. "I have loved you every day of 3 years." "I am aware. I have been aware for some time. Adrian, listen. I have decided not to sign the petition. I decided 3 days ago. I have not yet told my solicitor." A pause, long enough to be felt across the carpet between them. He drew breath, and she went on before he could speak. She required, she said, that the petition not be destroyed. It was to sit on the mantelpiece in this library, in the small glass paperweight he had bought in London on the 14th of April, where it could be observed by both of them at any hour. They would treat it as a thing they had kept and not used, like a ledger, like a scar. They would not pretend it had never existed. She would not have it pretended. "It will sit on the mantelpiece," he said. "For how long, Catherine?" "For as long as we are married." He understood,
very slowly, what she had told him. He set his hand on the back of her wrist, where it rested on the arm of the chair. A small, exact, courteous touch. The touch of a man who had earned, for the first time, the permission to make it. Then he said the only thing he could think of to say. The way a man says a sentence he has not been allowed to say before. Thank you. She accepted it the way a woman accepts a thing she has been waiting for. Without theatre, on a Tuesday evening, with the smell of beeswax and oil paint in the room, and a hawthorn just beginning to set berries outside the South Library window. It is, of course, the case that some readers will require an epilogue. We will provide one, briefly, because the rest of the matter is private. 6 months after the third Tuesday, that is to say in early November of the year 1815, a letter arrived at Ashbourne, addressed to Mrs. Anne Carmody of Lyme, Devonshire, care of the Duchess of Ashbourne. It had been posted from London, at Mrs. Carmody's request, to her own forwarded address. Mrs. Carmody had, after 18 years in a damp cottage in Lyme, accepted Catherine's invitation to spend her remaining Christmases at Ashbourne, in the small dower house, with a view of the south meadow, and a part-time gardener to weed the hawthorn hedges. She had moved in, with her cat and a great many letters from the late Duke and his late housekeeper, on the 1st of November. She was 71. Her knees still gave her trouble. She had not, however, in 18 years, been so well looked after. The petition for annulment had remained on the library mantelpiece, in a small, clear glass paperweight, for the entire summer. It was still there in November. The ribbon had faded, slightly, in the south window's light. The ink had not faded. The first line still read, in Mr. Brown's copperplate, Petition for declaration of nullity of marriage. Catherine Wren, Duchess of Ashbourne, petitioner. Adrian Wren, 4th Duke of Ashbourne, respondent. The last line still bore Catherine's signature. The respondent's signature line was still blank. Visitors to the library, and there were now, for the first time in some years, regular visitors to the library, including a small monthly meeting of a tenants' welfare society Catherine had founded in May, sometimes asked Adrian what the document was. Adrian, who had become in the last 6 months an entirely different sort of public man, would say only, "A reminder. My wife requires it kept. I have learned to do as my wife requires." He said it warmly. He said it slightly dryly. He said it with the small smile of a man who had been corrected, at considerable length, by the only person whose corrections he had ever welcomed. Catherine, when asked the same question by the more curious of the tenants' wives, would say, "It is a thing my husband and I keep to remember the year we nearly did not become friends." Then she would change the subject, because she was a woman who set the limits of her own confessional narratives, and because there was always tea to be poured. On a particular Tuesday evening in late November, with the first frost on the inside of the south window glass and a fire built up against the cold, Catherine sat for the 18th Tuesday of the portrait. The painting was almost finished. The hands had been finished for some weeks. The dress had been finished for a fortnight. Only the background remained, and that, Adrian had decided without consulting her, and then immediately consulting her, would be the South Library window, with a hawthorn outside it, in flower. "It has not been in flower since May," Catherine said. "I will paint it from memory. I have recently become competent at painting things from memory. It is a skill I no longer wish to use, but I have it." "You have it?" "Yes, Catherine. Yes. I have signed something." "What have you signed?" He set down his brush. He crossed to the mantelpiece. He took down the small glass paperweight. He removed the petition from inside it. He folded it open on the hearth, in front of the fire. He took up his pen. On the respondent's signature line, in his small, careful hand, he wrote, "I, Adrian Wren, Duke of Ashbourne, decline this petition for the rest of my natural life, and certify my decline by my own hand, this 23rd of November, in the year of our Lord, 1815. He signed his name beneath. He returned the petition, signed, to the glass paperweight. He set the paperweight back on the mantelpiece. He came back to the easel. "You may continue," he said. "I require to keep painting. I've decided not to leave the room until the painting is finished, and I have decided not to leave you for the rest of my natural life, and I do not, on principle, wish to make either decision twice in one evening."
"Adrian."
"Yes?"
"Sit a moment first."
He sat on the small stool he kept beside the easel.
She put her hand against the side of his face, a hand which, 3 years earlier, had counted 7 windows on a difficult morning, and which had, more recently, counted a great many other things, including the heartbeats of her husband when he slept beside her in the dark. And she held it there.
"You are warm," she said. "I had forgotten. I had decided, against considerable evidence, that you were a cold man. I had decided it on the 2nd morning of our marriage, and I had carried the decision forward through 3 years on insufficient examination. I should like, on the record, to retract the decision." He turned his face into her palm. "It is retracted, Your Grace." A small silence. The fire stirred in the grate. Adrian set his free hand on hers and held it there. She let him, because she had decided, some weeks earlier and without ceremony, to let him.
"The painting will be finished tonight," he said. "I had thought it would be finished in October. I have been delaying." "I know that as well. I am observant by nature, Adrian. I have always been so. I see a great deal, and I deliver my observations on a schedule of my own choosing."
He laughed. The open, slightly winded laugh she had been hearing more and more often over the summer, and which she had decided, privately, was the sound she wished to hear at her last hour, if circumstances should arrange themselves so politely. "Then I had better finish the painting." "You had." He finished it that evening. The hawthorn, painted from memory of May, set against an early November frost on the inside of the south window, bloomed on canvas long after it had finished blooming in life.
The portrait was hung in the small breakfast room a week later, where Catherine could see it each morning while she drank her tea, and where Adrian, who had begun, since June, to take breakfast at the same table as his wife, could see it as well, opposite him, every day of the rest of his life. The petition remained on the library mantelpiece, signed at the bottom, kept under glass. He had stopped being the man who inherited her with a house. She had stopped being a clock. They had finally, painfully, late, learned to be the same kind of weather. If you have ever stayed beside someone longer than you were sure was wise, because something underneath the silence kept asking you not to leave, you may understand the kind of marriage Catherine and Adrian Wren went on to have. Tell me, in the comments, whether you have known a silence of that kind, and whether you decided to wait it out. I should very much like to know. And if you would like to hear the next of these stories when it appears, please subscribe. There is, as always, a Tuesday coming.